Welcome to this informational meeting on Great Lakes water levels. Thank you all for coming. My name's Adam Bechle. You may have seen an email from me. I'm the Coastal Engineering Outreach Specialist at Wisconsin Sea Grant. For those of you who've never heard of Sea Grant before, Wisconsin Sea Grant is a locally focused state-federal partnership that promotes sustainable use of the Great Lakes through research, education, and outreach. Wisconsin Sea Grant itself is headquartered at UW-Madison, and it has satellite offices at Milwaukee, Manitowoc, Green Bay, and Superior. With me from Sea Grant is Lydia Salas. She's running our web stream, and she helps get social media and content out on Great Lakes coastal hazard issues. So if you see something out there from Sea Grant, it might be from her. I just wanted to acknowledge her work here kind of behind the scenes. So tonight we have a full program on Great Lakes water levels and coastal processes that are related to water levels and their impacts. This idea started with Keith Kompoltowicz reaching out to us at Wisconsin, looking to replicate some outreach he and the Corps have been doing in Michigan with their Sea Grant program and getting a lot of positive response. So he and a bunch of other folks from the Corps are in Wisconsin for a meeting this week, so it seemed like a really good time to try and get that going, and that's why we're all here tonight. So Keith and other staff from the Corps will be talking about water levels as well as some emergency management resources from the Corps. Following Keith, water levels are a big driver of what's going on with coastal issues right now, but they're not the only thing. We've got to worry about things like coastal storms, waves, precipitation, bluff stability. So we're going to cover a lot of those topics as well. So we have with us to start that conversation, we have Marc Kavinsky and Sarah Marquardt from the Milwaukee Sullivan National Weather Office.
We didn't hear record.
Well, let's just listen. Can we listen first?
I can't hear anything.
Okay.
You know.
Got to mute. Oops. I've got to start live stream and leave myself on. Okay. So sorry about that. So the Weather Service will be talking about waves, seiches, the role of marine forecasting, and things like that. Then when we move on to the land, I'm going to follow up talking a bit about coastal processes, affect coastal lands, and some mitigation strategies, at least a framework to think about. And we've got a bunch of resources out in the back that cover a lot of these topics. So we'll follow those presentations with questions from you all to the presenters, and we also have Sarah Szabo from the Wisconsin DNR on hand as well to answer any questions that may be directed towards the DNR. So just before we get going, some logistics. Bathrooms are out and to the right. If anyone needs to go, feel free to get up. Thank you to those who have signed in when you entered. This just helps us know who's in the room, where you're from, and gives us a count of how many people we have here. Also, we'll be recording this meeting. I'm doing that now, I believe. Let me double check that.
Sir, is there any way we can record the meeting?
The meeting will be available online afterwards once we get it posted. I am recording the meeting. And so if you put your email down there, I'll send out a link to everyone where you can either watch this again or share it with your friends. So if you haven't signed in on the way in, please play out. So before we get going on the program, it's usually nice to do a round of introductions with everyone in the room, but there's a lot of people in the room. So let's just sort of get a sense of where everyone's from. So to do that, let's show hands by what county you're from. So let's start at the southern end of the state. Anyone here from Kenosha County? Anywhere in Kenosha County? Nobody? Do we have anyone from Racine? Okay, handful from Racine County. Milwaukee County. Okay, we got a big chunk from right around here. Ozaukee County. Okay, that looks like another big chunk. Moving up, Sheboygan County. Okay.
Yes, Sheboygan.
A couple people from Manitowoc County. Anyone from Kewaunee County or further north? Okay, so mainly kind of epicenter around Schlitz Audubon Center, which is to be expected. So what best describes your interest in being at this meeting and in Great Lakes water levels? How many people here are Lake Michigan coastal property owners? Okay, yep.
I'm a Lake Michigan property owner.
Anyone from local government staff or state staff here? Okay, so we have some
I'm with the
representatives
town of
from the
Holland.
communities or in the state. Do we have any elected officials in the room? A couple of elected officials, probably from those municipalities. Any people doing work on the coast? Contractors, engineers? Okay, we've got 2 in here. Anyone just an interested resident from the area, just wanting to learn about water levels? Okay, we've got a good representation of folks like that. Anyone who I didn't cover? Anyone here I didn't cover? Okay, great. And then the last question, just to get an idea of the collective experiences we have in the room, because we have a lot of folks here. Let's reveal how long everyone in the room's been concerned about Great Lakes water levels issues. So who has kind of lived on the lake or remembers back 33 years or more when Lake Michigan was at its all-time high?
I've been here 55 years.
We've got about half the room. What about 22 years going back to the last time the water was highish in 1997? Okay, so we've got a pretty long history. And then those who haven't raised their hands, what about 7 years back when Lake Michigan was an all-time low? Okay, so we remember the opposite of what we're at now. Okay, and who is brand new to dealing with Great Lakes water level issues? This is kind of the first trip around. Okay, a couple folks. I will admit, I was alive when Lake Michigan was at its record high. I lived in Green Bay, so on the coast, but you may tell from my appearance, the water levels weren't really a huge concern to me in 1986. So finally, let's just take 2 minutes. Usually it's nice to know why you're here. Turn to a neighbor or someone you don't know and just kind of give them a reason why you're here. What are your concerns about water levels? What are you seeing? What are you doing? And I'll bring the group back together after about 2 minutes, but let's just get a chance to share.
I'm unable to see the speaker. Did I do something wrong here?
All right, so we've got about 1 minute left. So if you haven't flipped and shared with your partner, let's flip and do that now. All right, folks, let's wrap up our sharing, and we'll get moving on. All right. So, can everyone hear me? Is the mic still on? Okay, good. So I know there's probably not enough time for everyone to share stories with each other, but it is nice to know what other people are seeing and knowing you're not alone and really being heard about kind of what you're seeing. And so I just wanted to give everyone an opportunity at least to do that with one person. Can you hear back there? We need more volume. Closer than this? Okay. 1 centimeter. All right, speakers, 1 centimeter. Hopefully you learned something and maybe what someone else is doing and learn maybe what a different part of the coast looks like. So I hope that was valuable for you. Right now, I'm going to turn it over to Keith Kompoltowicz from the Army Corps of Engineers Detroit District to talk about water levels.
All right, good evening, everyone. As Adam said, this is kind of, we kind of put this together knowing that we were going to be in Wisconsin with some of our Lake Winnebago work that the Detroit District does, and really want to carry over some of the outreach that we've been doing in Michigan to great success. This audience that we have tonight is on par with a lot of the similar type events that we've done across Michigan, so it's really good to see a good crowd here. Shows a lot of, the passion carries over the lake. You know, in Michigan, we're passionate about our Great Lakes, and the crowd here today proves that the same passion lives in Wisconsin as well. I want to take a moment to introduce the team that the Corps of Engineers has. I'm Keith Kompoltowicz. I'm Chief of the Watershed Hydrology Branch for the Detroit District. It's the office in the Corps in Detroit that performs the water level forecasting and analysis. With me today, I have Dr. Lauren Fry. She is one of our water level forecasting experts. I also have Mr. Chris Warren. He's a hydraulic engineer. He's mostly focused on our Lake Winnebago mission, does a lot of hydrologic modeling in support of our Lake Winnebago. And then we also have Krystle Walker. She's here from our emergency management office. And Krystle will get into the role of EM. But we've been activated, our emergency operations center has been activated since the spring, dealing with the impacts of the high water levels, you know, and flooding and providing technical assistance to communities across the Great Lakes Basin. So Lauren and Krystle will be up in a minute to talk a little bit about specifically water level forecasting and the EM response to that. So just some notes about the water levels that you get from the Corps of Engineers. It's not a depth, but a surface elevation above sea level. And we use the International Great Lakes datum of 1985, which has its 0 point near the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, which is why we can say above sea level. We treat Michigan and Huron as one lake because they're joined at the Straits of Mackinac. So their levels rise and fall together. The Corps of Engineers and its water level forecasting and analysis is really focused on lake-wide mean elevations, not necessarily a water level at a specific point. And we use a network of water level gauges to still the water level surface. We don't get into forecasting water levels at specific points. We leave that to our colleagues at the National Weather Service to get into the point forecasting. We use that network of gauges again to still that surface water because the influences of the weather, wind, barometric pressure changes, can cause drastic and very short-term water level changes at specific locations. Again, the Corps of Engineers is really focused along the entire surface of the lake. The Corps in Detroit's the official keeper of a very long 100-year data set for monthly mean water levels. And the unique thing about that is it's coordinated with our counterparts on the Canadian side of the border. So we have a very unique mission in that the Great Lakes are an international waterway. And we want to make sure that the statistics that we're talking about and the forecasts that we release are consistent across the international border. So we spend a lot of time working with our Canadian counterparts in Environment and Climate Change Canada. They do a lot of the same work we do, and we come together often to make sure that our messaging is consistent. And then finally, the primary drivers of water level fluctuations are changing weather patterns and the resulting changes and fluctuations in water supply. So we'll kind of get into that last bullet in detail as we get into showing you why we are here, going from, as Adam mentioned, 7 years ago to record lows to now very close to record highs. So when we monitor these levels, we take a look at conditions in the entire Great Lakes Basin, which is the green shaded area, you know, kind of looking down on the lakes. We spend a lot of time tracking weather patterns, precipitation, evaporation, stream flows, snowpack, and put that all into play when we're doing our analysis of why water levels fluctuate, and then try to carry that forward along with some other tools that the Weather Service helps us with, you know, to do some forecasting in different intervals. I also show you the cross section of the lakes, and note here that the kind of the headwaters of the system is Lake Superior, and the water flows downhill. So it flows through the compensating works from Lake Superior into the St. Mary's River, down into Lakes Michigan and Huron, through the St. Clair River, past Detroit, into Lake Erie, over Niagara Falls, Lake Ontario, and finally the Atlantic Ocean. I use this also to point out that there are 2 locations on the Great Lakes where outflows from one lake to another are regulated. And they're regulated using internationally approved regulation plans under the auspices of the International Joint Commission. So the first one I'll talk about is at the outlet of Lake Ontario into the St. Lawrence River. It's regulated there on a weekly basis through the Moses Saunders Hydropower Dam. And the regulation of Lake Ontario outflow has no impact on any other lake other than Lake Ontario because of the influence of Niagara Falls. The second place where outflows are regulated are the outflow of Lake Superior into the St. Mary's River. And that is done through another international board of control. It's the Lake Superior Board of Control, again, under the auspices of the International Joint Commission. That's the technical support to that board is a part of what we do at the Corps of Engineers Detroit. And that's the outflow is decided on a monthly basis. It's important to note that the ability to regulate outflows does not mean you can regulate the lake level. The range of outflows is very small compared to the range of what naturally comes into the lakes from rainfall runoff and what leaves the lakes via evaporation. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. Just some high water photos from across the Great Lakes. This has been a Great Lakes wide issue since the spring. The upper right there is Stony Point. I'm sorry, the upper left there is Stony Point, south of Detroit. The upper right there is near St. Clair Shores in Michigan. The pier damage there is on Lake Superior, Grand Traverse Harbor and the Keweenaw Peninsula. And then the lower there is the South Haven structure, navigation structure on Lake Michigan. And I don't know if you had seen any of the images from yesterday on the other side of the lake in Michigan, but with the northwest winds, some of the structures from Benton Harbor, Michigan, all the way north to Petoskey were completely submerged with incredible wave action that was ongoing yesterday. So some of the images from yesterday were quite dramatic. So factors that impact the water level fluctuations, and this is the true driver of water level changes is shown on this slide. So we really track what's in that red circle, is we call that the net basin supply. And we lump the precipitation that falls on the lake surface plus the runoff from the surrounding land into the lake minus evaporation is one number, and we call that the net basin supply. Together with the inflow from the upstream lake, and all the lakes with the exception of Lake Superior have an inflow from the upstream lake, we lump those together, and that's the net total supply of water to that lake. Anytime the net total supply is greater than the outflow, the water level is going to rise. And the opposite is true. If the outflow is greater than the net total supply, the levels will decline. So this is what we spend a lot of time trying to quantify and forecast, is that net basin supply number. And the changes in that net basin supply lead to the annual water level fluctuations. So typically, the lakes are at their lowest levels in the wintertime as the precipitation that typically falls in the Great Lakes Basin accumulates on the ground in the form of snowfall rather than directly falling and running into the lakes. As we move into the spring, we get warmer temperatures that melts the snowpack. We also see increased rainfall that drives the lakes rising in the spring. They peak in the summertime. At the same time they peak, they're warming. They reach their warmest temperatures typically in the late summer, early fall. We get these cool, dry fall nights. That difference between the air temperature and the water temperature drives evaporation, and the evaporation pulls the lakes back down to their winter low. This is a very repeatable pattern. It's just the changes in how much the lakes are rising in the spring and declining in the fall that change the levels from year to year. And quite honestly, we've seen more drastic water level rises in the spring due to repeated wet conditions the past several years, and less than average seasonal declines because of, again, continued wet conditions and less evaporation. I'm sorry. The current water levels, this is a chart that's available on our website. It updates daily, and it just shows you, where we are. We aggregate the daily mean water levels into the monthly mean. That's the upper red square or rectangle that you see there. And I'm just showing the record highs for October. The high water levels for October for Lake Michigan are the highest in our period of record. September and October of 1986 were marked by very, very wet conditions and extreme amounts of flooding across a lot of the Great Lakes Basin. So if you look at water levels in 1986, they started declining a little bit in September, and then they rose dramatically in October because of how wet it was. And you can also see the records that we've set on the Great Lakes this spring. Note that we did not set a record on Lakes Michigan and Huron, though they are the highest since the records of 1986 on a monthly basis. So here's that 100-year data set that I mentioned. And a couple things I want to point out. The blue line is that recorded monthly mean water level, and the red line is the long-term average. And you can see that annual fluctuation. Every little kind of hump in the line there is a season. And you can see times of much above average water levels. You can see times of below average. And I want to point that just the past 20 years or so had been mostly marked by low water levels and even some record lows. The record low for any month in our period of record occurred on Lake Michigan in January of 2013. And the popular sentiment of the time was that low water levels were here to stay. This is what we're going to have to deal with. Then it started snowing and raining and snowing and raining and snowing and raining. And we had a record water level rise starting in that January 2013 to December of 2014. Lake Superior and Lakes Michigan and Huron have never risen that much over a 24-month period than they did in that time, culminating now in what has been a summer of record high and near record high water levels on the lakes. So what led to this? Simply, it's been unbelievably wet across the Great Lakes Basin. So this chart comes from our colleagues at the Climate Prediction Center. They look at the Great Lakes Basin as a whole and aggregate the month-by-month precipitation. And the 60-month period ending 31 August is the wettest in 120 years of records. If you drill down a little bit more, if you look at this type of chart for Wisconsin, the last 12 months are the wettest 12 months in, I think, 125 years of record. The last 24 months are the second wettest in that same time period. And extending back the last 36, 48, and 60 months are the wettest period in Wisconsin in this 120 to 125 year period of record. And you can expand that across most of the Great Lakes states. We've just been in this pattern that has brought extremely wet and active weather resulting in plenty of precipitation and at times too much. This spring was marked by an unbelievable snowpack, very high snowpack across a lot of the Great Lakes that was sitting on top of already saturated ground. So we went into the spring with a lot of snow sitting out there, a lot of water contained in that snow, and that water didn't have anywhere to go. Ran off into the lakes and started fueling that seasonal rise. Then we had flooding rains. The 60-day precipitation across a lot of the Great Lakes Basin approached 20 inches in some extreme locations, and a lot of places saw anywhere from 10 to 14 inches in 60 days ending June 19th. So again, a lot of snow, a lot of runoff, coupled with a lot of rain, drove the lakes up very quickly this spring. And it brings us to where we are currently. The stat that I keep pointing to is the city of Green Bay set a record for annual precip on September 22nd, with still 3 months to go in the year. And it's the second year in a row that Green Bay has broken its annual precipitation record. So this is just a snapshot of what September precipitation looked like. And now I'll bring up Dr. Fry to kind of talk about where we're at in terms of levels, some of the tools that we use to get into our forecasts, and show you some of the forecasts themselves.
To get it within 1 centimeter. Can everybody hear me close enough? Okay. So Keith brought us up to speed on where we are now. One of the things that we do in our office is provide forecasts of monthly mean lakewide average water levels to the nation. And perhaps our most widely used and widely known product is our monthly bulletin of Great Lakes water levels, which is a product that goes out 6 months. It's a seasonal forecast. Does anybody in this room get the forecast in the mail? That's good to see. We send it out, I think, to over 4,000 people in the nation, and this is a forecast that's coordinated with our partners in Canada, similar to the way that we coordinate data that Keith described. Every month we get on the phone after we've run our forecast, and we coordinate our forecasts with our partners in Canada. So they're sending their forecast out to people on the Canadian side. So what I'm showing on this graphic includes some of that information, but also additional information. And this is a graphic that's on our webpage. The bulletin that we send out, that exact product is on our webpage, but this is another way to view that forecast. So what you're seeing here, I'll have to use the pointer. Okay, so there's a lot of information here. The numbers on the left, on the left axis, those are in meters, and on the right axis are in feet. So that's the lake levels. And these purple dots are showing the long-term average monthly mean lakewide average water level for each month. So that'd be the typical seasonal cycle for Lake Superior in those purple dots. The blue trace is showing the daily lakewide average water levels for last year, so for 2018. And then on the red trace, that's showing the daily water levels for this year. These horizontal bars on the top and on the bottom are showing the record high and record low lakewide average water levels for lakewide average monthly mean lakewide average water level. Monthly mean lakewide average water levels for each month. It's always a mouthful. And so you can quickly see here over the past several months, we've been at or above record highs on Lake Superior, teetering very close to record high on Lake Michigan Huron on that red trace. So the last thing to point out is our monthly bulletin forecast, and the point on Lake Michigan Huron, since that's what people are interested in here today. So the green dot is what we're calling our most probable forecast. It's our forecast that we think is most likely to happen based on current conditions and forecasted conditions. And then going out, you start to see a little bit of uncertainty. So there's a vertical bar, this little red vertical bar is showing our range of uncertainty in the forecast. So we've got October, November, December, we're starting to see in December a little chance of hitting the record high water level, but really in January through March, to the remainder of our forecast, we're seeing the possibility of new record high water levels. I should point out that we're starting at levels that are higher than last year, right? Which increases our odds of being higher again next year. So by January, we'll be starting January at about 11 inches higher than we started last year. So while it doesn't mean that we're guaranteed to have higher water levels than this year, it increases the odds from where we were at last year. So these are similar graphics for the rest of the lakes. We're seeing similar patterns. As Keith talked about, we've had records on all of the other lakes over the past season, and we're predicting continued high water levels across the Great Lakes for the coming 6 months. Another product that I want to point out that's on our webpage is, it's not really a forecast product, but it's a water level outlook that we put out. This is a scenario-based product that allows us to ask what if kind of questions. So what you're looking at is same kind of data that we saw on the other graphic, where the dots are the long-term average levels, the line going back 2 years, those are the observed water levels. You can see the record highs and lows as little hash marks above and below. But in addition to that, the gray band that follows the observations, this large gray band, that is showing what could happen under all of the kinds of conditions that we've seen in the past. So we have over 100 years of net basin supply data. Net basin supply is the precipitation plus runoff minus evaporation. And we have over 100 years of that data that we can use to drive a model of water levels. So we're simulating what the water levels would be under all of those conditions that we've seen in the past, given our starting water levels here. So that's that gray band. The individual traces that are on there, those vary from simulation to simulation that we publish, but they're scenarios that are of particular interest to people at the time that we're producing the product. So we've got 3 scenarios that are highlighted there. The green scenario is showing what the water levels would be if we see conditions that are exactly the same as we saw last year. So that would bring us up higher, right? And the yellow line is showing kind of the opposite of that. It's showing what we would see if we have conditions that are similar to the conditions that we saw during the dramatic decline in the late 1990s, so 98 and 99. So this graphic shows what the water levels would be if we saw that kind of a decline. And the purple line is what we would see if we had supply similar to 93 and 94, which is just kind of an average year. So take home point here is first that if we get another very high supply, that'll put us at higher levels than last year, but there's a wide range of variability. Even with that wide range of variability, notice that even if we see the very low supplies, the lowest supplies that we've seen in the past will still be a little bit above our long-term average water levels. So we can expect to be at high water levels likely over at least the next 12 months. It would take very, very dry conditions to bring us rapidly back to long-term average conditions. And I guess I do have a zoomed in version of this so you can see better on Lake Michigan here on. So again, you can see if we have the same kind of conditions that we had this year, we'll be at that top end of the range and very high water levels. Okay, the last thing I want to mention is that we have a document on our website, and actually Adam found a lot of this document in his office and brought them so you can pick them up on your way out, or maybe you have already on your way in. This is a publication that was written in the 90s, by our coastal engineers, and describes coastal conditions across the Great Lakes basins. Recently, we've had our engineers review this document to make sure things are still relevant, and it is still relevant with the exception of the contact information that's published in there. So please pick up a copy if you're interested in coastal processes and how they might impact you locally. Okay, so here's our contact information. I'll be here afterwards, so feel free to talk to me and Keith. And with that, I'm going to introduce Krystle Walker, who's going to be talking about our emergency management and the kinds of activities that the Army Corps of Engineers has been involved with.
Great, thank you. All right, everyone, good evening. So as we've seen, it's been a banner year. So these high lake levels have definitely resulted in flooding. Keith showed some interesting pictures. Believe me, I have quite a few more. So what that means in terms of us for the Corps, we do have an emergency management mission, and we do have authorities that can help communities with flooding. So for our purposes, we have activated our Emergency Operations Center to provide support to the communities for high lake levels. So over in Wisconsin, what that means is that we are currently providing technical assistance to 3 counties. So those are Kewaunee, Marinette, and Oconto. We've been in contact with various other county emergency management agencies. So they're kind of aware that we're in the area and just what we're doing for support. So these 3 counties are in addition to 7 in Michigan, and a late breaking addition is we're providing assistance to a tribe in Minnesota. So this is a widespread issue, and we are definitely have boots on the ground, and we are in our office plugging away, trying to provide as much support as possible to you guys. So what that technical assistance means is we are able to go into your communities and provide assistance to your governmental agencies, be that your city, county, state, with any challenges that your community is experiencing due to high lake level flooding. So typical requests have been, so we have sandbags. Where do we put them? How do we tie into high ground? Where is the high ground? How do we properly fill a sandbag? I have limited sandbags. How should I distribute them across my community? So that's been pretty much the typical request. But we can also provide a lot of other types of support. Technical assistance within the Corps Emergency Management Authority essentially provides us the ability to answer those challenging questions. We can provide staff in the community with engineering expertise, hydraulic expertise, just basically getting this amazing repository of expertise into your community to answer your questions. We can do inspections of flood protection structures that are already in place. Any projects that you have, we can kind of check them out, see how they're performing. We have data, we have inundation products that we can provide. And then in addition, we also have a research and development branch of the Army Corps that specializes in ice. So these high lake levels are going to freeze at some point and start washing ice up in places that they may not have been before. So that is a concern that we've been talking through with a lot of different communities and engaging that research and development arm to see what kind of solutions we can get into your communities. All of this is provided at no cost to you guys, to your cities, to your counties. We're able to do that completely on Army Corps of Engineers funding. So the process for us providing that is for your city, county, state to reach out to the Corps and just basically say, hey, we need some assistance, and we can start that conversation about what we can do. So in addition, again, lots of pictures. So in the top left, you can see we've been doing sandbagging efforts exhaustively. Most of these are in Michigan, but I've now seen some sandbagging efforts over in Wisconsin. This particular site is actually currently under 3 to 4 feet of water. So really that's an additional challenge. Not only do you sandbag, how do you adaptively sandbag as levels change, as those storms come in or waters rise or fall. On the right is another example of technical assistance. We can actually come into your community and provide sandbagging training. If your community is taking on a massive sandbagging effort, we can oversee that and provide recommendations for how to strategize, how many staff, how many sandbags, how do you resource this entire effort. In the bottom left, we've been doing a lot of utility inspections. So in this particular case, this community, all their fire hydrants were underwater. That becomes a life safety issue, especially when ice completely makes them unusable. How do we get those things high and dry? And then the middle and the bottom right. So if you have water on your streets, that is also a life safety issue. How do you get an ambulance into that street to help a neighbor in need? So how do we get the water off those roads? Is it sandbagging? Is it pumping? We can provide those recommendations on a community-wide scale. So I know I blew through that quickly, but the real takeaway here is we completely understand that this has been a challenging year. We are right there with you. If you have any questions about how we can assist you in your community, I am part of a 3-person staff. We work out of Detroit. My information is at the bottom. We have our chief, Patrick Cooney, and then my colleague, Jeff Yoakum. Don't hesitate to reach out. We love talking to you guys, and just let's see how next year hashes out.
If you're okay with it, I can send out that information.
Yeah, absolutely.
The same email as I got this. So
Okay.
worried about scribbling it down.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you to all our presenters from the Army Corps. Up next, we'll have Marc Kavinsky from the Milwaukee Sullivan Weather Forecasting Office. And we've got to do a swap of computers, so bear with us while we get that going. And I'll come around you. Yeah, yep. Just gotta try it.
All right, hello everyone. I'm meteorologist Marc Kavinsky with the National Weather Service Office, serving Southern Wisconsin. We're located in near Sullivan, which is pretty far away from here, about 45 minutes in eastern Jefferson County. We do cover a good chunk of geography, the forecast, and the forecast for the near waters of Lake Michigan and the open waters of Lake Michigan. So we do have a vested interest in what goes on over the lake. And we're just one of 122 field officers of the National Weather Service. Joining me tonight is Sarah Marc, our new service hydrologist at our office as well. So we'll be here to answer questions afterwards, talking about the conditions. So for tonight, I'm going to key on, there's going to be some duplications. As a meteorologist, I have to talk about precipitation. So I'm going to duplicate a little bit about what Keith just showed you. And let's just say I'm not going to flood you. Trying not to flood you with precipitation. But really, I'm going to recap, what happened over the last 10 years. I'm going to go into the short-term and long-term forecasts that are just fresh off the press. The Climate Prediction Center just put out their forecast for the winter months, as well as going up in spring and summer. I'm also going to be covering the weather elements that really contribute to water levels. It's been touched on before, but mainly it's precipitation, but evaporation also comes into play. So Keith talked about this a little bit, but I wanted you to realize that the drainage basin in the Lake Michigan is quite large. Much of the area, much of western Wisconsin, western Michigan, and into east central and northeast Wisconsin and much of the UP of Michigan. All the water that falls in that area drains toward Lake Michigan. So it's not just areas adjacent to the lake that drains into lakes. It's a large area. And we can see from the stats that the length of the basin is over 300 miles. That's considerably large with a width of almost 200 miles. And the drainage basin area is pretty extensive, over 45,000 square miles. So there's a lot of water that falls across this large area highlighted in green that drains into Lake Michigan. And a lot of snowfall. Snowfall, snow melt. So of course, meteorologists, I'm going to be talking about the last 10 years. This is a loop that shows annual precipitation that fell over the drainage basin. So what we're looking for, if you see in the top right, you see the year that the precipitation fell. And we're looking for areas that are in tan and tan yellows. That's more normal precipitation. But when we see a lot of oranges and reds and even purples, there's a lot more precipitation that fell across Wisconsin and Michigan, draining into Lake Michigan. So here out of 2010, a lot of yellows and greens, normal precipitation of those years. 2012, again, pretty quiet year, near normal precipitation. See, starting in 2013, 14, we're starting to see a lot heavier areas of precipitation highlighted by the oranges and reds. One drier year, 2015, but then 2016, a lot of wetness, a lot of oranges and reds. This is indicating above normal precipitation. Normal precipitation generally is in the 30 to 35 inch range per year. And the red values are showing 40, 50, dark red 60 inches per year. And as we know, Keith mentioned Green Bay has already set a record precipitation for the year already. They're over 12 inches above normal for this time of year. Milwaukee is about 5 inches above normal for this time of year. And Grand Rapids across the lake, they're about 4 inches above normal. So let's take a look at the same situation, but this is compared to normal. So we're looking for, the dryness as the near normal conditions are highlighted in the yellows and tans. This is 2012, 2013, when we start seeing purples and blues. That's indicating to you that the precipitation for that year was above normal in that area. 2014, here's again the dry year, 2015. After that, 2016, a lot more extensive areas of blues and purples and blues. Here's 2018, and then of course 2019, the whole area was experiencing above normal, much above normal precipitation for that year. So again, once more, 2011, 2012, pretty close to normal. 2013, a few pockets of heavier precipitation in the drainage basin. 2014, a pretty wet year over there in Michigan, but we recuperated in 2015. Then 16, 17, 18, 19, a lot more extensive and widespread heavier precipitation. And all that water and snowfall, again, draining into the Lake Michigan drainage basin. Let's just take a look at recently what's going on. Last 30 days, 6 to 10 inches of rain falling across much of southern Wisconsin into western Michigan, and also up there in upper Michigan. So, and then even 4 to 5 inches in that orangish area. So a lot of heavy rainfall has fallen over the last 30 days to 60 days. And here it is compared to normal for the same time period, 3 to 5 inches above normal for western Michigan into southern Wisconsin, and also up there in the UP of Michigan, 1 to 3 inches above normal in northwestern lower Michigan toward Kewaunee County in that area. So a very wet period, as we know, that we've been dealing with recently. So besides the precipitation, I did want to touch on evaporation. Evaporation is something else that really affects, that has some effect on water levels. It's a delicate balance between precipitation and evaporation. Evaporation is very difficult to measure on the Great Lakes, but we do know that this is the time of year when the greatest evaporation tends to occur on the Great Lakes. It's not when it's the hottest out, it's not during July and August, because typically there's high humidity, and that really doesn't promote higher evaporation rates. What we're looking for is at this time of year, we have the cold, drier air kind of coming in from Canada, like what's going on right now. When that situation occurs, and we have the cooler, drier air moving across the warmer waters of the lake, that promotes higher evaporation rates. So we're looking for a large temperature difference between the air and the water. Typically at this time of year, if you look at this chart, this is the annual curve of Lake Michigan water temperatures. Typically at this time of year, mid-October, we're looking at Lake Michigan water temperatures typically in the mid-50s. And that's about what it is. The red line is indicating what's going on this year for 2019. And so right now, the Lake Michigan water temperatures are in the mid-50s, but we've had several bouts of very cool air over the last couple of weeks. And cool air temperatures have fallen to the 30s and 40s, and that's promoted greater evaporation rates. But to balance that is we also have had the heavy precipitation that has occurred. So if you're asking, so it's very difficult to measure what kind of play we're getting from the evaporation that followed behind the precipitation that fell. So it's something that we keep an eye on, but we do know that if we have a cool, dry autumn followed by a drier winter, I would say that would be the best setup for promoting evaporation on the Great Lakes. Now, one thing that evaporation does result in is it does cause the lake temperatures to cool more rapidly. And so when we have lake temperatures cooling more rapidly, that's going to promote increased ice cover during the winter months. And so if we have more ice covering the lake, that cuts back on evaporation. We have the ice covering the lake, not as much of the lake surface exposed to the air, and that's cutting back on evaporation rates. So, like I said, there's a delicate balance going on between this evaporation, precipitation, and the ice. But one thing that's good about ice cover is it's a lot easier to measure. We have statistics on ice cover on Lake Michigan going back to the early 1970s. And what I wanted to point out here, what this chart is showing us is that we've seen a general trend of increasing ice cover on Lake Michigan over the last 45 years, or back into the early 70s. Typically, during the year, during the colder months, the percent of days with at least 25% or from 1 to 25% ice cover is typically in the 35 to 60% range. That's the percent of days typically with some ice cover on the lake. And we call the ice season typically runs from mid-November through the end of May. Going back to the period of record, that's when ice has been seen on the lake. Okay, so that's about, we see a general trend of increasing ice cover on the lake during the period of record. I know it's a small period, but let's go back 45 years. So what about those days what about those years when we have higher ice cover? There aren't as many of them. This is the years when we've had between 26 and 50% ice cover on Lake Michigan. And there's a fair number, at least half of the years. But if you'll notice, there were many more years with higher levels of ice cover in the 70s into the 80s. But over the last 20 years or so, that trend is definitely on a decrease. So what that's saying is it's more often that we don't get the higher levels of ice on Lake Michigan during the cold season. We have more days with some ice, but not as many days when we have a lot of ice on the lake. I thought, well, let's take a look at the days when we have greater than 50%. Take a look at the years. And as you can see, there haven't been that many years when we've had greater than 50% ice cover at any time on Lake Michigan. In fact, just looking back since the mid-90s, there's only been 4 years. And of course, we all remember those 2 cold years back a few years ago when that polar vortex, something like that, settled down over us. And we were watching our bushes die in the snow outside. That was a very cold year, and that resulted in a greater ice cover on the lake. But as you can see, the number of years when we have high ice cover on Lake Michigan have definitely going downhill. What does this all mean? Oh, before I get to that, if you're looking for ice on the lake, the best time to go is from the second week of January through the end of March. Probably in that time, there's a pretty good chance there's going to be some ice on the lake. So if you're looking for ice on Lake Michigan, do a little ice fishing from that second week of January through the second to third week of March. Pretty good chance of seeing some ice on the lake. So what does this all mean? The peak amounts of ice on the lake are decreasing. We are seeing an increase in number of days with some ice on the lake. But the number of days, the number of years, when we have higher levels of ice, greater than 26% ice cover on the lake, that's going down. So it's hard to say how this really results in evaporation rates. Because when you have more ice on the lake for a longer period of time, I would think that would somehow affect evaporation of the water in Lake Michigan. But we will have less ice typically for long periods of time. So, like I said, it's a delicate balance, but I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at the ice statistics and how it might affect evaporation. So let's get into the short-term and long-term forecasts. I'm sure that's what you've been waiting for. These are fresh off the deck. The Climate Prediction Center just put these out. This is actually a short-term forecast for maybe next week. Taking a look at what's happening next week. This is for the 21st through the 25th. And what's going to be happening is we're going to have a storm system move through the area, probably in the Sunday through Monday night time frame. That's going to bring a period of precipitation to the area. You can see all the to the east, temperatures are likely to be above normal on the east coast, but the bluer areas highlighted by the B, there are strong indications that behind that storm system, areas in the plains all the way down into Texas, temperatures are probably going to be below normal. And this is a transition or a progressive pattern, so those below normal temperatures are probably going to be in our area, probably by the middle of next week. And here's the associated precipitation forecast for that same period for next week. We're looking at probably a pretty good chance we see some showers, maybe a few thunderstorms move through the area in the Sunday night through Monday night time period. But then those showers are probably going to be pushing off to the east, and we'll probably see drier weather return probably by Tuesday or Wednesday. So again, like I said, this is a short-term forecast, but the Climate Prediction Center are pretty confident that above normal precipitation is going to occur from southern Lake Michigan all the way down into the southeast U.S. next week. Let's expand our view and take a look at the long-range forecast for the area. Now, this is for the winter period. This is just fresh off the press. It was released this morning. And this is for the winter period from December through February. And I hate to say it, but there's really equal chances that we're going to be above or below normal. There's really no clear signal. There's no clear signal to the Climate Prediction Center people that we're going to go one way or another. And so what that means is that there's a 33% chance we'll be above normal or below normal or normal. Sorry, I know that's non-committal, but that's what we meteorologists do. And that's for the period for the winter, December through February. Let's take a look at the spring pattern. Oh, not much change. There are indications. If we were down in in Georgia, Alabama, we say, oh yeah, it's going to look good. It's going to be warmer than normal for the spring period. But here again, non-committal, really no clear signs pointing toward one way or another whether temperatures are going to be above or below normal for the spring period. But there are a few indications that far northern Wisconsin and northern Minnesota and Lake Superior might be leaning toward a better chance of below normal temperatures. And moving on to summer, again, equal chances for our area. There really just no clear signals. They're looking at the equatorial regions. They're looking to see if there's an El Nino or a La Nina situation developing. And really, there's no clear signals one way or another at this point whether temperatures are going to be above or below normal, at least for now, through next summer. A little bit different story, though, for precipitation. I'm sure you don't want to see this. But what they're thinking is that this area, much of the Great Lakes and the northern plains, has a better than 33% chance, maybe even a 45% chance that we'll be seeing above normal precipitation during the period from December through February. Now, this isn't really based on any type of La Nina or El Nino situation, what they're using is they're using statistical guidance, and they're looking at the pattern that we've been in, which has been very wet, and they're thinking, well, there's probably a good chance that this is going to continue. And so you see that A, that stands for indications that will be have above normal precipitation during that period, which means above normal snowfall, because we're talking about the winter months. So they're thinking that snowfall is going to build up across the western Great Lakes and build up and then be ready to melt in the spring. So what does it look like for the spring? Uh-oh, not good. The spring months, from March through May, again, they're leaning toward statistics and persistent pattern, resulting in above normal precipitation for us right into March, April, and May. That wouldn't be good, because that means that we have rainfall on top of melting snow, similar to what we had earlier this year. So not good, and that really isn't a good pattern, but it's we're just basing this on statistics and persistent weather patterns. Things kind of dry out a little bit for the summer, however. All that precipitation or the better chances move off to the east of us, and again, now there'll be more non-committal, equal chances of above or below normal precipitation for our area over the summer months next summer. But as we know, showers and thunderstorms can be very hit and miss. So getting into some water level information, maybe a little duplication from what you saw earlier. But this is the period of record for Lake Michigan / Lake Huron water levels, going back for about 100 years. And we can see there's peaks and valleys. And what I wanted to point out is that that first peak from July 1929 to August 1952, there was about a 23-year gap between the two peak periods. And the next peak period from 52 to 74, another about 20 to 25 years. And then after that, the periods were starting to decrease from 74 to 86, when we set our record high monthly average water level on the lakes. It was a 12-year period. And then there was a 11-year period from 86 to a minor crest there in July of 1997. And then we had that that 15-year period of dry conditions below normal, from the late 90s through the early 2010s. And then since about 2013, the water levels have been steadily going upward due to the heavy precipitation that we've been dealing with. So zooming in to the lake level forecast, here it is over the past 30 years. Again, there's our record high, October of 1986, 582.35 feet. And then, here's that period when we were below normal. And then all of a sudden, since January 2013, the forecast, the monthly average water levels have been steadily rising. And so I wanted to zoom into the forecast period that's put out by the Army Corps. And this forecast is released about once a month. I believe it's once a month, right? And so it was at the beginning of the month, and what the Army Corps does is they release a range of forecast information. So they give an upper range and a lower range of what they think the water levels will be. So what I did is I painted out the average water level that's forecast for that month. I just wanted to point out that the green dot is showing where we are for October, through October 15th, where we were at 581.71 feet. Which at the start of the month, that's kind of toward the top of the forecast range. But considering the increase in evaporation and the less amount of precipitation we've been experiencing very recently, the water level should continue to go down. So in November, we're looking at about a 0.2 of a foot drop, another 0.2 of a foot drop in December, and then in January, continuing, but then starting to level off as we get into February and March. As that snow begins to melt and drain into Lake Michigan. But as was pointed out earlier, I did want to say that that means that we're going to be starting out the year about 6 to 11 inches higher than we started out last spring. So that really doesn't bode well with the forecast of higher than normal precipitation, need for higher than normal precipitation, and starting out at higher levels, like water levels. That really isn't boding well for what we're going to be dealing with next year. And so the Weather Service will be keeping an eye on the erosion and Lake Michigan, the erosion and lakeshore flooding threat. Keith talked about this has happened just 2 days ago across the lake. Very strong west to northwest winds gusting to 55 miles an hour, which is causing extensive beach erosion with high waves reaching 10 to 15 feet on the other side of the lake. And that was causing considerable erosion with some lakeshore flooding. I will say that fortunately, we on this side of the lake don't have to deal with these type of weather conditions that often. Fortunately, we don't really get these strong northeast to east situations that cause high waves and pounding waves and high winds very frequently during the autumn months. Whereas across the lake, they occur, fairly frequently, fairly regularly. And I will say that, maybe once or twice a autumn or early December, we will have a storm system move through that does produce stronger onshore winds on this side of the lake. So we'll be watching for that, and when we're seeing strong onshore winds, persistence, keeping up waves heights of like 10 feet or higher, then we'll be thinking that there could be a chance for more significant beach erosion, shore erosion on this side of the lake, along with the threat of lakeshore flooding. So the Weather Service will be keeping an eye on that, and we'll be letting you know when we think that situation may occur. And just to get back into how wet it's been, let's take a look at the last 100 years. And this is an area. This is just an area of Wisconsin. You can see the map. It's east central Wisconsin, Fox River Valley up to Door County. And over the last 100 years, there's been a steady trend upward of amount of precipitation in this part of Wisconsin. And in fact, as you can see that I've circled, each decade, the amount of precipitation has been increasing by over a quarter inch for each decade that we've been keeping track of precipitation in east central Wisconsin. And obviously you can see here, since about 2010, there's been a steady increase and very high rates of precipitation, annual precipitation that have occurred in east central Wisconsin, much above the normal that's indicated there. And even if we cross the lake and go into west central Michigan, even higher rates of precipitation that are falling, a greater slope, a greater trend over the last 100 years. And you can see over the each decade, you get an increase of over 0.6 of an inch of precipitation on that side of Lake Michigan, the west central part of Lower Michigan. So incredible amounts of precipitation that have been falling, and the trend line is continuing to go up. So that really doesn't bode well for us. So to conclude, for next year, I think we're going to be dealing with more high beach levels, high water levels. That's going to continue to erode beaches and dunes on parts of the lake. This is when I was visiting southwest Lower Michigan. You can see that there was a considerable beach erosion, resulting in some of the superstructure being exposed, and some of the beach is totally gone with the rocks just being exposed. So I'd say that I'm leaning toward these type of conditions probably continuing into next year with more results of some structural damage as well. That's all I have, and I guess we're saving the questions for after everybody speaks. Any good questions? Nothing tough. Wow, I've answered all your questions. Oh, go ahead.
Okay, given the possibility of sea level rise, how can that impact the Great Lakes? Saltwater in the Great Lakes?
Well, with that terrain, with that elevation.
So if you remember that profile slide that I showed, where the Niagara River flows
Thanks, Mark, and we'll have time for more questions of Mark after, in a little bit after I speak. So if you got more for Mark, please remember them if you can, and he'll be available to answer them later. Now I just have to go through my checklist to make sure that the computer transfer was good and everyone can see what we're doing online. How do we look, Lydia? Looks good. Okay. So we've had a bit of an introduction to what water levels are and some outlooks for where they might go and what waves might look like, and when you'll hear from the Weather Service. So I'm going to talk about what happens kind of when that water interfaces with the land. Many of you own that land, and just a glimpse at what some adaptation options are. Thank you for bringing up living on the coast. Like Lauren said, there's a ton of copies out there, more than enough for everyone here. Basically, what I'll be talking about is an overview of living on the coast. So you can dig into more detail in there, and I'll cover that again at the end. So the factors of shoreline and bluff recession when our water levels, don't have a laser on here, when our water levels and our waves come and hit our land, there's a lot of different factors that go into what causes the land to erode and recede. And so what we're looking at here are just sort of the natural processes. And to start, let's talk about what we've been talking about so far, water levels and waves. So we're going to look at my cartoon. This is all cartoon, so accuracy may be up for debate, but it should get the concepts across. So here's our coastal bluff. And waves and water levels will impact the beach. Now under our period of high water levels, we can take the waves and they start impacting the toe of our bluff. And so when those waves start impacting the toe of our bluff, it's made out of soil, made out of here, mostly cohesive clay soils. They start taking away some of that material. And that's gone forever because those bluffs were put down by the glaciers. Unlike a beach where sand kind of comes on and off and sand can flow around, the glaciers laid it down. Once it's gone, the glaciers, I don't think are coming back in our lifetime to relay some soil down. So as continual wave attack at the toe of the bluff happens, particularly under high water level periods, we start to see that bluff slope steepen. We get this sort of start. And so that's not a stable slope for that soil. Here in Lake Michigan, we think about 22 degrees, like a 2.5 to 1 slope, stable for our materials on the coast. So once we get unstable, that slope is going to want to get to its stable angle. And so we see in this cartoon, the piece of the bluff slumps off because the soil just can't hold that angle anymore. That material moves to the toe of the bluff, and if the water levels remain high or the waves are large and keep eating away at it, can take away that material and start working again at the toe. We get another steep slope. Again, that can fail back to a stable slope angle. Okay, and that material's moved down to the toe of the bluff, and now is providing a little material for the waves to eat up. And so this cycle can begin again. Maybe water levels will go down and you have that material at the toe. Maybe water levels go down here and we're left with a somewhat unstable slope that may want to get back to its stable angle. A lot of variables here, and a lot depends on the material that your slope is made of. But this is sort of the general process. So now we can see sort of this is the slope we started with, and the waves have eaten away at the toe, the process has continued, and now we're at, again, about that starting angle. And this is a cartoon, so it may not represent any individual slope, but this is the general idea of what happens. Now, we can have these failures, in some cases, work their way up the slope, starting at the bottom, and we see failures working their way up. If you live on a really tall bluff, you may not have seen any movement up at the top of the crest of the bluff, but there may be some issues going down at the bottom, and that failure may be working its way up the bluff. If you're on a shorter bluff, like say we have in the Racine County area, sometimes that failure surface immediately just goes all the way up to the crest. So we see houses getting encroached on a lot quicker on our shorter bluffs because that failure doesn't have that much distance to work its way up to. There we're talking maybe 30, 40, 50 foot bluffs as opposed to 100 foot bluffs that I'm sure a lot of you who our homeowners may have. Also, in some cases, we may just get a large rotational slump where the whole slope fails and slides out to the lake. Again, this is all kind of dependent on the geology of the different slopes, but the idea is the same. The waves, particularly when water levels are high, remove material and the slope becomes unstable. And once the slope's unstable, even if the water levels went down 10 feet and stayed down forever, if you have an unstable slope, it's going to want to get back to that stable slope angle. So it's important to keep in mind, not just the water levels, not just the waves, but we have this whole host of natural processes that act on our coastal lands and our coastal bluffs. Water levels and waves are a big driver, but we also have things like on the slope, the water management or water on the slope, it can also be a big impact. So here we see surface water runoff. If you have concentrated surface water runoff, can make a gully and start taking the soil material away directly from the surface of the bluff. Groundwater getting into the bluff, that can sort of lubricate the soil particles and make it more easy to fail. Or if you have a seam of groundwater coming out, like this here in Milwaukee County, that can directly move the soil off the bluff. So deep of groundwater here, and it's pushing out. You can see kind of up here, you can see that soil being washed right out, and that's mostly done by the groundwater. And so we can start to see failures in the middle of the slope, not really related to the water levels and waves that closely. And so again, if we have groundwater coming out, we can remove material and get a failure that way. I'll give you a little example of this. So I was out at a homeowner's house that I know a couple of weeks ago. This is in Milwaukee County, and went down to the beach. And this is probably a bit rare, but his shoreline doesn't show evidence of wave erosion. And there's a couple of reasons for that. But looking this way, you don't see much. Starting to turn back, you see a little bit of missing material, and that's all sort of wetland vegetation. That soil is very wet there. And then going even further, this video will play, you can see the water dripping down. So there's definitely a groundwater issue here, localized where we see groundwater concentrated and sort of removing material. So this is one instance where waves weren't the main issue, because where the waves might be hitting, we didn't see any evidence of that. But the groundwater was causing issues. So again, thinking holistically about the bluff and what are all the things that can be affecting it. Some cases, it's very obvious that wave erosion is the key. So thinking about natural processes, water at the toe, as well as the surface and the slope. And also human alterations can have a big impact as well. So if we change the nearshore dynamics, suppose a bunch of riprap or wetland takes place, that changes how the waves interact with our bluff and can cause increased erosion elsewhere where protection is in place. We modify our drainage. We like to put impervious surfaces at the top of the bluff so we can have a house to live in. And so we got to think about, where is that water going? We definitely don't want to channelize it, focus it, and have it run down the bluff, because it's a lot easier to increase bluff erosion than it is to slow it down. And then vegetation can have a good service of holding soil together. If we remove that vegetation, we remove one of our lines of defense for our slopes and our shorelines getting held together. So one takeaway, and living on the coast pounds this, is think holistically about the shoreline and the bluff and all the factors that can affect it. And so what that book stresses, and what I like to call a top-down approach to looking at protecting coastal investments, and that's really starting at the top where your property is, and looking at the things that affect the coastline on the way down. So at the top, important to manage land use where your property is, managing water and managing vegetation. At the slope, still managing water, managing vegetation, and maintaining stability there. And then at the toe, you can reduce wave impact if it's absolutely necessary. Sometimes it's not the main problem. If it is, certainly it's something to take care of. Sometimes you don't have to do that. So managing land use, this is taken from, we've taken from living on the coast. This is the concept of geotime. So over a long period of time, the shoreline recedes at a rate. So we can lose 10 feet in one go, we can lose 20 feet in one go, but over 30 years, maybe we see 1 foot or 2 feet per year. So the concept of how much geotime do you have, how many years until that rate of erosion gets back to something you care about. And so managing land use is thinking about, well, how can I maximize my geotime? A lot of you, I'm sure, already have your house where it is. Maybe some of you are thinking of building a house and you can affect that a lot easier. One way that we try to do this is setbacks. The minimum setback in Wisconsin is 75 feet from the ordinary high water mark, where basically the toe of the bluff. Sometimes that'll put a house minimum right on the middle of the bluff. And so that's an indication that sometimes our ordinances and regulations don't ensure safety, right? You could build a house on the middle of your bluff. You probably wouldn't do it knowing what you've seen in the last couple of years. And so this is a figure showing all the different components to think about if you're trying to think of what's a safe distance from the edge of the bluff. Safe in air quotes, of course, but a safer. So one is thinking about that distance. How many years at a certain rate of recession do you need to move your house back? That's your recession setback. What's the distance? If you're moving, your bluff is shown 2 feet per year, and you want your house to last for 60 years because houses last for a while. That's 120 feet right there for a recession setback. Stable slope angle. What's the angle your bluff is now, and what's that stable angle for that slope material? Like I said, Lake Michigan, 22 degrees roughly, and I think the rule of thumb is a 2.5 to 1 slope. So thinking about that, and then the last piece is a facility setback. So this is sort of a buffer distance, a safety zone. If a house needs to be moved or work needs to get done, that's sort of a safety factor. So a lot of ordinances you'll see incorporating these three elements of a recession setback, a stable slope setback, and a facility setback. So that's useful if you want to build a house, but if you have a house already, how is that useful? Well, building relocation is one option. Thinking about the top of the bluff first, if you have the space to get your house to a safe distance, sometimes that can be the most economical option. So this is a house in Sheboygan County. You can see pretty close to the edge of the bluff. Fortunately, they owned land on that side of the road, and so they moved the house and built onto it. So there's costs that are, you occur, putting a new foundation, hooking up utilities, but keep it in your toolbox if you have the space, because there's a lot of times where it can be cheaper than trying to place toe protection at the bottom and fight the waves. You sort of bought yourself a lifetime of not having to worry about that bluff erosion. So that's roughly where the building started, and that's where it is now. And they actually moved the highway too. So everyone was moving property. So another principle is managing water. Now I've blurred out the house location. I don't want to point fingers at anyone, but directing runoff away from the bluff can keep water from going over the edge and starting moving material right from the slope. Here you can see some downspouts pointed right at the bluff. That's a pretty easy thing to correct. One thing you could do is maybe route that with corrugated pipe or something to a municipal storm sewer to the front of the yard, away from the bluff. Another thing you could do is get a rain barrel, collect that runoff from your roof and use it to water plants. So it's not coming down at a point during a storm and causing erosion. Minimizing impervious surfaces so that water doesn't run off and directly flow onto your bluff. Here's some pervious pavers to sort of slow down that runoff. Intercepting perched groundwater. This was a property where water was ponding at the surface, so the homeowner installed a French drain, which is basically gravel with a permeable pipe, and routed the water to the base of a ravine that was by his property. So got it off the bluff slope, safely in a pipe down to the base of a ravine, and it wasn't causing slope erosion. Directing wastewater away from the bluff. Again, I blurred out the house, but this had a septic mound system placed right at the edge of the bluff, which is bad for two reasons. One is you're putting water right into the bluff and causing some instability there, and putting a big pile of weight on the edge of the bluff. That does not help your bluff stability. So thinking about those ways, where's water on your surface and how can I get it away from my bluffs? Third principle, maintain and enhance vegetation. So this is a graphic that shows all the good things vegetation does for our slopes. It can slow down water as it runs off over the slope. Those roots hold the soil, and we can evapotranspirate water out of our slope and get it out of the groundwater. And so some things to think about, deep-rooted and native vegetation is always best. Turf grass, those roots maybe go 4 inches deep. That's not doing a whole lot of work to help your bluff out. One thing you can do, you still want a nice lawn, is having a no-mow buffer of at least 10 feet, where even you let the grass grow, or maybe you think of some native vegetation. Don't clear cut vegetation, but you can still enjoy a view. Making a view shed where you can enjoy your lake views. And if you have a lot of trees, there's ways you can prune them up so you have a nice view of the lake without getting rid of that helpful vegetation. So again, things to think of at the top of the bluff to help not do speeding up bluff erosion. So first we started with our house kind of towards the edge. Some things that could be done: move it back, collect water in a rain barrel, vegetation. Moving to the slope, again, managing water, vegetation, and stability. A nice vegetated slope works to slow down groundwater as well. Managing water in and on the bluffs. So there's ways to, if groundwater is an issue, to sort of remove groundwater from the bluff. I know wick drains are one thing that people are doing, horizontal drains, again, getting the water out of your slope and depositing it safely to the toe where it's not eroding the slope. And so here's kind of what some of those drains look like at the toe. Again, it's keeping the water off the bluff. And then if you do have an unstable slope, there are some options. If you need to reshape the slope, on the left here, cutting back your slope to a stable angle if you have the space. If you don't have the space, some other options on the bottom left here, terracing with some retaining walls that can sort of get your slope stable, but not as far as cutback. You're using retaining walls to help buy you some room. And then integrating some sort of fill, sometimes that can be an option if you really, your house is really close up to the edge to restabilize that slope. Because again, even if the lakes went down 10 feet and never came back up, if your slope is not stable, it's gonna get stable. So you wanna make sure that that means you're out of harm's way. So having a more stable slope, nice vegetated slope is good. And then getting to the toe, reducing wave impact. If these practices, if you can't move it, your house is in danger, you need to stop that wave erosion, then we think about reducing wave impact at the toe if necessary. And so a couple options that I know get used, not so much around here, groins. These are shore perpendicular structures that are built to trap the sand that flows along the shore that the waves push around. So in this picture, you see, in general, wind goes from left to right. So that means waves drive sediment from left to right here. So a groin is a structure that sticks out into the water and traps sand as it moves along the coast, fills up a beach, which can help break waves. Now, groins are not super effective when we have high water because the water levels inundate that beach and you sort of lose that protection. Another thing about groins is your neighbor downdrift, you're blocking the sand from getting there. So there's a pretty standard profile of they start losing land on the downdrift side of the groin. So things to think about when you're considering shore protection is there can be effects. And so one demonstration of that is potential impacts of groins to adjacent properties. This is a field of groins that was put in the 30s. And you can see that shoreline change over time and back to a sort of equilibrium profile. Scientists sort of have a way to describe it, what they think that shoreline is going to look like. So it's sort of a long-term plod towards an equilibrium shape based on how many groins you have, how long they are. You're reducing the sediment supply downstream, and you change the nearshore dynamics, and all of a sudden, there's no sand to replenish this beach. So it's gone. So things to think about if you're thinking about groins, they're an option, but you always have to think about, well, what are maybe the consequences? Revetment maybe is a little bit more common up in this part. of the state. So this is a shore parallel structure. It's sloped, it's made of erosion resistant material, pretty much stone, armor stone, angular stone. And this protects the shore from erosion. So this isn't simply a pile of rocks. That can provide some protection, but an engineered revetment takes some measures, things you want to see if you're getting a revetment in. Filter cloth, which helps when the waves hit rocks, that it doesn't make sediment come right back out to the voids in the rocks. Filter cloth holds that in. Then you have a layer of smaller stone, again, to absorb that wave impact. And then on top, you have the big heavy stone that can resist the wave impacts. And so if you're thinking about getting a revetment and you see a drawing and it doesn't have those sorts of things, that's something you want to bring up. And there's resources out there and a fact sheet on working with contractors. But a well-engineered revetment has those things as well as nice reinforcement at the toe so that it doesn't get scoured out from underneath and then it slides into the water. So again, revetment is different than pile of round boulders. You want those rocks to be interlocked to withstand wave forces and sloped at a pretty shallow angle, 2 to 1, something like that. 1.5 to 1 is the maximum. And so this is kind of what it looks like. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this. Large armor stone that can resist the forces of the waves. Revetments don't come with no cost either. You have to think about what the effects on the shore is. Again, blurred out the properties here, but this is April 2007, a relatively new revetment. And then 5 years later, this is low water period. This is the erect low water. You see big erosion adjacent to the revetment. 1 foot per year before, 10 feet per year after that revetment went in. And then again, same story, April 2012, a little bit further downstream, and a few years later, over 10 feet per year of erosion. So something to think about and why we say shore protection structures, if necessary, not to be used willy-nilly, because they do have effects, and there's ways to sort of think about and work with the contractor to try and make sure you minimize those effects, but they do happen. So if necessary, but being cognizant that neighboring properties might get impacted. And the main reason revetments have this impact is because the waves strike the revetment and reflect backwards. So that erodes the near shore, and the waves don't break as much anymore. They come in higher into the shore and hit the bluff with more force. So one way to maybe mitigate that is rather than doing individual approach piece by piece and you have a lot of ends of the revetment, working together with neighbors, you can at least mitigate some of the effects of that piecemeal approach on the coast that can have negative impacts in between properties. A cooperation approach is one way to get at that. Not perfect, but it can help with costs as well as those impacts to the neighbors. A couple other things you might hear about a seawall. This is similar to a revetment, but it's a vertical structure made of usually concrete, erosion-resistant material. Breakwaters, these aren't really used mainly for private property owners. Not a lot of them in Wisconsin, but those sort of intend to block wave energy before it reaches the shore. Real quick, some things maybe not to put on the shore. Concrete rubble with rebar in it. That's a safety hazard when that concrete breaks apart and leaves rusty metal on the ground. Poorly interlocked stones and concrete. The waves can kind of get in between and around that, toss them around. Dumping stuff over the bluff slope may get some material down, but you put a lot of extra weight on your slope. That can reduce the stability. And then flat plate-like rubble, like this, waves love to just toss it. Because the waves don't just hit on top, they come up underneath and toss that around. So it may be able to take a semi and a 747, but waves act differently on concrete. Some things to consider when you're thinking about shore protection structures, they're not a forever solution. There's flanking around the ends of shore protection structures that can happen. That armor stone gets weathered, and freeze thaw and break apart into smaller pieces, can't take the forces of waves anymore. Instability, or revetment eventually might get displaced and start to be unstable. And if gaps develop in a structure like this one did, when the water levels come up, it undermines the whole thing. So maybe some things if you have shore protection structures to be cognizant that you may want to get it inspected or take a look at it and basically maintenance of shore protection structures is definitely needed for long-term function. It's not a set it and forget it thing. So all sorts of things to think of when we're thinking about protecting the total bluff. So again, top-down approach. What does the top look like? How can land use, water, and vegetation be managed? Moving down the slope, and then the toe. If it's necessary to save your property, that's when you should be thinking about that. And that's the main message of the Living on the Coast book. I'd like to point you to some resources. There's a handout on the table out there with a link to a bunch of these resources. If you pick it up, there's a little search bar. If you search resources for Great Lakes coastal property owners, you can find the web version. That way you can click the links rather than typing in the URLs. Some of the things on there, Living on the Coast. Again, grab one on your way out. It's great. If you want to see sort of how the shorelines changed at your property over time, the Wisconsin Shoreline Inventory and Oblique Viewer, there's a link on that sheet. You can zoom into a property, look at pictures from the 70s, look at pictures from 2007, 2018, 2019 will be up eventually in April, but you can see how property has changed over time. And then just recently, we've mapped using historical aerial photos how much that shoreline, the crest of the bluff and the full bluff have changed. So here, we've represented these colors and dots of how much over 60 years. This dark red is over 60 feet of erosion. So you can see some of these spots. So if you're thinking about your geotime, this is one place to kind of get that information. Adapting to a changing coast. This is a relatively new booklet. This has a bunch of different strategies for dealing with erosion and bluff recession. Breaks down, I think, about 19 options, what it is, benefits and challenges, pictures, and then links to more information. And then some fact sheets from Seagrant that go in more detail into some topics like stabilizing coastal slopes, those different strategies, cutback, terracing. This has a lot more detail about that. Great Lakes coastal shore protection structures and their effects on coastal processes. Talks a little bit more about the tow protection strategies and what the benefits and negatives of those different options are. And then this fact sheet out there, working with engineers and contractors on shore protection projects, gets into some of the things you might want to be thinking about when dealing with a coastal contractor. It may be a little bit different than someone drywalling your house. So it has some good things to think about, questions to ask, things to look out for. And that is also in the back as well as available online. And then I just want to pull up real quick the website from the Wisconsin DNR. There's a link to this on the handout as well, placing erosion control structures on the Great Lakes. This has a lot of good information on there, a little decision tool to figure out what your permitting needs are, and links to other resources. Sarah, did you have anything you wanted to add about that site? Okay, all right, well that covers everything I had to say. If you're on your way out, please fill out a sign-out sheet. Grab some of those materials. Hopefully they're really helpful for you. And for now, I think we'll turn it over to questions for anyone who's presented, or Sarah is also available to answer questions from the DNR. So, any questions out there? In front row.
Lake Michigan is dry by the spring.
Anyone want to get that? Okay, sorry. Asking about. So the question is what would be the prediction or what to expect water levels to be by the spring?
Sure. So if you remember the slide that we had that showed our 6-month forecast. So we'll start in January. So we're predicting right now that January of 2020, in the middle of our forecast band, is going to be about 11 inches higher than January of 2019. And then from there, if we get very wet conditions in the following months, the spring will be on the higher end and likely set records for the months of February and March. Our forecast horizon is only 6 months, so we only get to March. but it's very likely, given the consideration that we're going to start 2020 higher than we started 2019, that higher levels still next year are probably pretty likely. Putting a number on it right now is just very difficult because we don't know with any certainty what type of winter we're going to see.
How high is the water level at Lake Superior? Who decides when to let Lake Superior water into the
So the question is about Lake Superior and its water level and the decisions that go into the outflow from Lake Superior into the lower lakes. So Lake Superior is also very high compared to its long-term average. It set records this year for several months. It has never been higher for the months of June and July in our period of record, and I believe it tied August, even May. So it's also very high compared to long-term average and set records. The process of setting the outflow from Lake Superior into Lakes Michigan and Huron is a internationally approved regulation plan that's put in place by the International Joint Commission. And what that regulation plan does is it takes the level of Lake Superior and the level of Lake Michigan and Huron, along with a gate setting. There's a 16-gated structure that spans the St. Mary's River. Those are the three pieces of information that it needs to calculate the outflow. And what that regulation plan aims to do is balance the water level of Lake Superior and the water level of Lake Michigan and Huron relative to its long-term average. And you have to consider that together, Lakes Michigan and Huron are bigger than Lake Superior, so that's why we use a standardized average. So simply, when Lake Superior is higher than its standardized average than Lakes Michigan and Huron, the regulation plan will call for a higher outflow. If the Lakes Michigan and Huron average water level is higher than its standardized average than Lake Superior, the plan will call for a lower outflow. Important to also is that the plan attempts to mimic what would occur under natural conditions. So we have very high water levels in the system. Naturally, the outflow from Lake Superior would also be very high. So the current outflow from Lake Superior is high as it would be normally without any influence or ability to change it.
Any energy producing shoreline protection schemes, and what's the approximate value of shoreline protection around harbors, et cetera, in Lake Michigan?
So your question is energy producing shore protection, so like harvesting wave energy?
Yes.
I'm not aware of any shore protection structures that sort of harvest wave energy. It is something that's done kind of experimentally out on the ocean coast, but not necessarily in a wave protection strategy. It's more buoys floating out in the water and rocking back and forth. So not that I'm aware. And then your second question was the value of shore protection around harbors in the Great Lakes?
Yeah.
Lake Michigan? I am not sure off the top of my head. One of the projects that I have going on is sort of a tool to help marinas and harbors value the value of their infrastructure. So I have the cost numbers that we can use to calculate that. We haven't gone out and valued all the infrastructure, but significant. I think we did a test pilot on Port Washington and came up with a number of over 50 million. And again, this was with a lot of approximations, using numbers from different marine contractors and just kind of measuring things on maps and estimating water depths. So that's maybe one reference point. So.
As far as forecasting out 10, 20 years, I mean, I know nobody can put a number to it, but is anybody taking a look, trying to do a longer term forecast for the region, especially considering effects of climate change?
So the question was thinking about a long-range forecast for water levels, 10 to 20 years, considering changing climate, effects like that.
I'm gonna bring Dr. Fry up to tackle that.
Thanks. Yeah, well, there are people looking at that. And there's unfortunately no clear answer as to whether we expect to go up or down as a general trend. It's not like sea level rise where we think up, you know. So what we expect to see is, we say, is be prepared for highs, be prepared for lows.
That weather forecast.
Yeah, I think so. So we talked, Keith touched a little bit on the change from the record low period and ending in beginning of 2013, and then we had a rapid rise. Well, during that period in the early 2010s, there was a lot of discussion among the scientific community, federal agencies. Everybody was talking about this, wondering if this is the new normal, whether we would be experiencing low water levels forever. So I think we've learned a lesson from that discussion, following that we don't expect, or we can't necessarily predict a trend at this point, going into the distant future. But what we can say is that it will take a while to get back. It would take a while to get back to normal conditions, even if we have normal to below normal water supply over the coming years.
Yes, I'd like to know if there's a team of people or individuals that we could hire to look at our club, who are engineering people who want to sell me something. Somebody who's neutral, that can come look at the club, give me an opinion, and I can tell them that.
That's a really good question. So the question is there sort of a team of people or someone that can come out and assess the bluff without trying to sell you something? Is that an appropriate characterization of your question? Yes. So I'm Wisconsin Sea Grants Coastal Engineering Outreach Specialist. So that's something I could do. Generally, it's good to have a group of people together, because if I tried to go to everyone in this room's property, that's sort of all the work I could do for the rest of the year. That would be one option, but you're not going to really get sort of a slope stability analysis. It really mainly be sort of, well, yep, we're seeing toe erosion, and the distance to your house is this, and here's the options you might want to consider. I'm not trying to sell you anything. Perhaps a professional geologist who you could hire, they could do a bit more involved work and look at just answering the question, how stable is my slope? They wouldn't necessarily be selling you a revetment or a groundwater drainage system, but you could get sort of that sort of assessment done.
It would have to be a geologist that would do fault and bluff erosion, all the types of geologists. So
Yeah.
there's someone that you would suggest the content?
No, because Sea Grants is a non-advocacy agency. I don't pass out any recommendations. There is on the list of resources, there's a handout with a link of known contractors and engineers. It's in no way, and you go to the page and you'll read all the legalese. It's in no way a full list or a recommendation for anyone. It's just known contractors and engineers who have done work on the Great Lakes. It's a good starting point. It's not comprehensive. You may find other folks, but that's a place to start. I saw the hand in the back first.
You talked a lot about residences that are on top of the bluff. For those residences that are at lake level, or that are at lake level and have a road in front of them that are at lake level, I'm trying to understand how panicked to be when it looks like the lake is going to flow over our road, and the only way to get to our road is to go down the bluff. I don't even know how to frame the question. What kind of thought is given to how to predict or project when the water will get high enough that it's just gonna flood the road in Milwaukee County?
So the question is, can we flood a road or something like that? Is that something the weather service forecasts?
Well, like I mentioned in my presentation, we keep an eye on the winds and waves, and we look for an extended period of onshore winds of northeast. Now, say we're getting gusts of 30 to 40 knots for a prolonged period of time, like 6 to 12 hours or even longer, and that's going to cause waves, wave heights of at least 8 feet, 8 to 12 feet, 8 to 14 feet, pounding the shoreline. Then the chances for erosion and lakeshore flooding will be increased. And you'll see the National Weather Service will put out a lakeshore flood advisory, watch, or warning to let people know that there's a greater chance of that occurring. So we will be keeping an eye on that. Like I said, fortunately, we don't get those situations too often on our side of the lake, but they will occur maybe once or twice in the fall season. Right, we're trying to take that into account. We kind of have a quicker trigger finger on putting out these advisories because of the higher wave levels. We've noticed that, even when we have, east-northeast winds of 10 to 20 knots, 15 to 20 knots, it's causing some minor, some smaller erosion and some lakeshore flooding, especially like down around South Shore Yacht Club, down in southern Milwaukee County. They get flooding when they have onshore winds of 10 to 20 knots. So we know with these high lake levels, we're much more susceptible to flooding of the lakeshore roads and minor erosion. So we're keeping an eye on that.
And I might add, so Marc and folks he work with can sort of look at what the water levels are, maybe if there's a storm surge and what the wave heights are, but once you get down to the local scale, then you see those surge and waves interacting with the imagery, the depths offshore, what sort of coastal structures are there, then it becomes a lot more complicated to get that exact level at a local height. So we can know what the lake level's at and what maybe how much the winds that push water levels in, but I don't think you're prepared to give a specific elevation all along the shoreline for that. So I think, yeah, the lakeshore flood warnings, because there's a very comprehensive study looking all along the shore, just the big probabilities of elevations at certain spots. So doing it in real time is really difficult. And that's just speaking from someone who knows how the waves interact with those structures, not necessarily a forecaster. So, Lydia, you have a question on the chat?
Yeah, we have a couple questions on the chat, but I'll just start with one. We have a question about the dynamics of sand dune erosion and beach erosion. Do they differ from bluff erosion, like you were talking about in your presentation?
Yeah, so the question, fidgeting hands or how you think what's from. So the question was, how does beach and dune erosion differ from bluff erosion, basically? And so the main difference with beaches and dunes is those are primarily composed of sand, and sand and dunes evolve through time. So beaches, if your beach is kind of left and sand is eroded, some of it has gone out off into the lake. A lot of it is sitting out where you can't see it in the near shore. And so the fall and winter, the waves take that away. The waves in the spring and summer start to bring that sand back. So sand kind of comes and goes, and so dunes certainly can be eroded and gone, but they also evolve and can build back over time. Bluffs, like I said, were laid down by the glaciers, and once that material is gone, it's clay. That sort of really small material, clay, silt, glacial mix. A lot of that, once it gets in the water, it's off into the middle of the lake, and the sand that's in there stays near shore. But in Wisconsin, we don't have a ton of sand in our bluffs. Like Michigan has all sand in their shoreline. So that's kind of maybe one of the main differences. So back in the room here. Yeah.
This is a clarification on a question that was asked earlier. So if you look back, I know that going forward, it's very difficult to forecast where things are going, but we can look backwards. And I've seen data going back to, there's a paper published, I think, 20 years ago, looking at lake levels back to 1836. And there was a height that was very similar to the current height. And then you see these periods where for the last 200 years, every 20 or 30 years, you get up to this level of the lake. And the question is, for the people who live in those lower lying areas on Beach Drive or those kinds of areas around the communities, what's the chance that we're going to be 2 feet above the current level? Or are we very likely to be, at the historic high, and it may go up a little bit, but it's very likely to come back down? I guess, 2, 3, 4 feet, is that something that we could look, we should be worried about? Or when you look back 200 years, and you see this cyclic nature of these heights and the way, 1836, we had water that was at least as high as we have that we're having right now. So I'm just wondering, how do how do you roll that into your statistical models?
So I'll repeat the question. So basically, looking back, a lot of stuff we've seen is the past 100 years, and we have really reliable data. Looking back 200 years, some of the data shows higher levels than we saw in these last 100 years. Keith can maybe speak to that. But also the question is, what can we expect? Can we expect something 1, 2, 3 feet higher than what we're at now? And what the probability of that is? So I'll let Keith answer that.
Thank you. There's a couple of different research papers that try to build a hydrograph of Lake Michigan going back several thousand years. And the one I'm referring to is done by a gentleman out of Indiana University. His name is Todd Thompson. And he looked at the tree lines along the shoreline. And you can see these tree lines. If you look at Google Earth, you can see, linear stands of trees going inland. And that's indicative of and how he built this hydrograph that shows water levels thousands of years ago. I don't know if it's hundreds of feet higher than they are now, but significantly higher than they are now. Obviously, a lot changes. The Earth changes over the course of those 1,000 years. Whether or not we get water levels 4 feet higher at some point in the future, I think it's impossible to say that. I mean, in looking at what our forecast window is 6 months, and it's very difficult to predict with any certainty water levels in that 6-month window, let alone trying to predict something 10, 20, 30 years out. I mean, there are simulations that researchers are doing. And remember what Lauren said, when we were in the low water period, a lot of the headlines were this is the new normal. Get used to it. It's going to go even lower from here. Fast forward 7 years, we're talking about record highs again. And the thoughts now are we've covered the range of Lake Michigan water levels, which is 6 feet between high and low in a 7-year period. Maybe that's what we need to be prepared for, are these very fast changes between extremes. And that, I think, is the popular sentiment now going forward, is that water levels are going to fluctuate as they have going back several hundred years. Maybe now they fluctuate faster between highs and lows, and that's what we need to be prepared for.
All right, we see 2 hands up. Let's take those 2 questions, and then we're getting close to 8 o'clock, so I think, respect for everyone's time, we'll take those 2 questions and wrap up. I think, if you have a burning question, we'll be around a little bit afterwards, so all the way in the back. Let's see.
Okay, one thing I'm just thinking about is the things that we've talked about tonight. For the most part, have been all talked about some things we could think of in ways of protecting ourselves or some way defending ourselves against the water getting higher and higher. But we haven't discussed at any point anything we could do about the higher water itself, or to keep the water from getting higher and from keeping it from doing so much damage by going higher and higher. I'm thinking, like, can't we get a train and haul 100 tank cars of water out to California or something? I mean, everybody is just sitting here talking about, oh, look at this graph over the last 7 years. Look at this graph. People's homes are destroyed. Highways are being destroyed. People can't move. People are losing millions and millions no urgency. We're just looking at the charts and we'll see what it's going to be like in another 3 months. I mean, there has to be something done to mitigate the height of the water, and it might be moving the water somewhere.
Thank you for that question. So to repeat it, the gist of the question is there something we can do as humans, some engineering solution, can we lower the water levels of the lake intentionally? Is that accurate?
Yes.
Does anyone want to?
I know the court.
Sure. I'll just say, I'm sorry, I'm coming out of view. I'll just say, yes, we are dealing with extremely high lake levels that are causing, in some places, significant damage to property. I will also add that we need to be careful, we need to be cautious of precedent that is set. So if for some whatever reason it is decided that we are going to take the tanker method and start shipping water elsewhere, who stops it? There are agreements between the Great Lakes states and the Canadian provinces. It's called the Great Lakes Compact. It limits the diversion of water outside of the Great Lakes Basin without the express permission of all 8 states and Canadian provinces. So there's that compact that's legally binding that kind of is in play here. But I think the bigger picture, the takeaway is that there's really nothing we can do. We're at the mercy of what has been an unbelievably wet period, a record wet period, and that has driven water levels to these extreme highs, and it's really driven by Mother Nature. What humans can do is maybe an inch of influence. What Mother Nature can do is on the order of feet of influence. And we've seen that measure of feet, 6 feet even, on Lakes Michigan just over the course of 7 years.
And I do appreciate the question because it is thinking about what can we do? I mean, that we're all in this room thinking, what can we do? And to kind of follow up with Keith is thinking about the similar questions that you were probably getting in 2013 when we had low water levels. Is there any way we can keep water in the Great Lakes? And so just 7 years, we've changed that question dramatically. And so that's, I think, just illustrates sort of what, like you said, nature is dealing us, and these big questions that kind of change dramatically. So, but it is, I do want to say that, you know, thinking about everything is very appropriate. So I think the question identified with you.
I see that nature we have no control over what nature puts into the Great Lakes. Well, considering that compact, how much does man control the output of the Great Lakes relative to the variability we have in 6 feet?
So the question was, how much do humans control the output from the Great Lakes, maybe as a system, and maybe also from Lake Michigan Huron, and then relative to that, the 6.4 foot fluctuation we've recently seen.
So there's no man-made ability to release more water from Lakes Michigan and Huron, other than a very small diversion of water at Chicago. That's coming into. So as we talked about, we can influence the inflow from Lake Superior into Lakes Michigan and Huron. And the water level of Lake Superior and the water level of Lakes Michigan and Huron go into that calculation. Once the water gets into Lakes Michigan and Huron, the outflow is the St. Clair River, which drains Lake Huron into Lake St. Clair near Detroit. That is an uncontrolled river, meaning that the flow in that river is completely dependent on the water levels. And that river, because Lake Michigan and Lakes Michigan and Huron are very high, the flow in that river is also very high. So there is a lot of water leaving naturally from Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. The small diversion at Chicago sends water to the Mississippi River basin. It's a long, very controversial history, but it's limited by Supreme Court decree to a very small amount, and it has minimal impact on water level fluctuations.
All right, thanks, Keith. And so with that, I think we'll close up. And if you have individual questions, we'll definitely be around. I do want to say, if you didn't hit the sign-in sheet on the way in, please do on the way out. That way I can send a link to the handout and recording. I believe the recording is going to be successful as long as I hit the button to say stop. So please do that on the way out. The table of resources. One thing you find the one-page handout with the caution high water sign on it that has the links to all the resources. Take a copy of whatever you feel like on the way out. And finally, let's give a round of thank yous to Keith and Marc. Marc and Sarah from the Weather Service, Sarah from DNR, and I'd also like to thank Lydia for running around trying to keep the live stream running. And then thank you to the Schlitz Audubon. Thanks, Lydia. Thanks to the Schlitz Audubon Center for hosting us tonight. It was a great venue, enough for all these people, and really appreciative to them. And finally, thank you for your attention, for showing up. Really appreciate it. We had a long program, lots of information, and I just want to say thanks for coming. And with that, we'll close out tonight.